For 7 years, Jedidiah Cooper had let brutal winters bury his past. He lived alone at the edge of the world, knowing better than anyone that the howling winds of the Bitterroot Mountains didn't just chill a man's bones, they erased him. But on the coldest night of 1874, the mountain delivered something the frost couldn't claim. A frantic, desperate pounding on his heavy oak door cut through the blizzard's roar. When he threw the bolt, he didn't find a lost hunter. He found a freezing woman clutching an infant, flanked by 2 shivering children, bringing a storm of trouble that would change his solitary life forever. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in a matter of hours, a sudden, violent plunge that native trackers called the White Death. Jedidiah Cooper had spent the afternoon securing his livestock, a single mule and 2 hardy pack horses, in the reinforced lean-to beside his cabin. He was a man carved from the very granite of the territory, broad-shouldered, heavily bearded, with eyes the color of a winter sky and hands scarred from years of trapping and surviving. He wanted nothing to do with the world of men. Society had taken everything from him down in Missouri, and he had retreated to the high country of the Idaho Territory to be left strictly alone. The fire in his massive stone hearth was roaring, casting long, dancing shadows across walls adorned with pelt stretchers and iron traps. Jedidiah was oiling his Henry repeating rifle when the noise started. At first, he thought it was a dead branch striking the roof, but the rhythm was too human. Thump, thump, thump. He racked the lever of his rifle out of pure instinct. No one traveled Trapper's Peak in November. Opening the thick, iron-hinged door, the gale nearly knocked him backward. Swirling white powder blinded him for a second. But then he saw them. She collapsed over the threshold the moment the door gave way. "Help," she rasped, her voice barely a dry whisper. Jedidiah dropped his rifle. He grabbed her by the shoulders of her frozen, threadbare wool coat and dragged her inside. That was when he saw the bundles behind her. A boy, no older than 12, was practically carrying a younger girl, their faces blue, their lips cracked and bleeding. "Get in. Move, boy, move!" Jedidiah barked over the wind, grabbing the girl and shoving the heavy door shut against the storm. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the ragged, wheezing breaths of the intruders. Jedidiah knelt beside the woman. Her bonnet had fallen back, revealing dark, tangled hair frozen with icicles. In her arms, wrapped in a terrifyingly thin shawl, was a toddler. The child was alarmingly quiet. "Ma'am," Jedidiah said, his voice rough from disuse. He pried her rigid arms apart to take the child. "Let me take him. You need to get near the fire." "Don't," she gasped, her eyes snapping open. They were fierce, terrified amber eyes, wild like a cornered mountain lion. "Don't take my baby. If you don't let me warm him, he's going to die," Jedidiah stated bluntly, not sugarcoating the reality of the high country. The bluntness worked. The fight drained from her, and she allowed him to lift the small boy. Jedidiah carried the child to the rug in front of the hearth, barking orders at the older boy. "You, strip out of those wet coats. Get your sister wrapped in that heavy bear pelt on the cot. Now." For the next 3 hours, Jedidiah's solitary sanctuary was transformed into a triage center. He brewed a bitter willow bark tea to break the fever he could feel radiating from the toddler's small chest. He heated stones in the fire, wrapping them in thick flannel to place at the feet of the shivering strangers. As the color slowly returned to their cheeks, the pieces of their story began to assemble in the quiet cabin. The woman introduced herself as Charlotte Stanton. The boy, trying desperately to stand tall and look brave despite his chattering teeth, was Thomas. The little girl, staring wide-eyed at the massive bear pelt she was wrapped in, was Sarah. The toddler, burning with a dangerous fever, was William. "We lost a wheel on the wagon 2 miles down the pass," Charlotte explained, clutching a tin mug of coffee with trembling hands. "The horse broke its leg in the rut. Thomas had to put him down." Jedidiah glanced at the 12-year-old boy. The kid's eyes held a haunted, hardened look that no child should possess. "You shouldn't be up here," Jedidiah said, his tone gruff, almost scolding. "This pass is a death trap in late autumn. Where is your husband?" Charlotte's gaze dropped to the scarred wooden floorboards. The firelight caught a deep, purple bruise on the side of her neck, partially hidden by her collar. "Arthur is dead," she said quietly. "Cholera. Took him 3 weeks ago in Cheyenne. We were trying to make it to Oregon, to my brother's claim." Jedidiah studied her. He had survived the wilderness by learning to read the signs: a broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss, a shift in the wind. Charlotte Stanton was lying. Not about her husband being dead, perhaps, but about the circumstances. People fleeing cholera didn't drive their wagons up treacherous, abandoned mountain passes in the dead of winter. They fled into the mountains when they were being hunted. "Well, Mrs. Stanton," Jedidiah said, standing up and towering over the small family, "Oregon is a long way from here, and this storm is going to bury this cabin in 6 feet of snow by morning. You're not going anywhere for a long, long time." The blizzard raged for 4 unbroken days, locking the cabin in a cage of white. For Jedidiah, the sudden intrusion of 4 breathing, moving, speaking humans was a shock to his system. His days, usually spent in meditative silence, checking traps and curing meat, were now filled with the chaotic symphony of a family. Yet, to his own surprise, he didn't hate it. Little William's fever broke on the 3rd day, thanks to Jedidiah's constant administration of herbal poultices and snow melt water. The first time the toddler sat up and babbled, Charlotte wept. She had hidden her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking, and for the first time, Jedidiah felt a strange, protective tightness in his chest. He awkwardly placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of comfort that she leaned into just a fraction. Tension, however, simmered beneath the surface. Thomas, the eldest, was fiercely defensive of his mother and deeply suspicious of the towering mountain man. One crisp morning, after the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a blindingly bright, silent world, Jedidiah went out to chop wood. He found Thomas already at the woodpile, struggling to lift the heavy, splitting maul. "You're going to break your back, boy, or chop your foot off," Jedidiah said, stepping off the porch. Thomas glared at him, his small jaw set. "I'm the man of the house now. I have to provide. I don't need your help." Jedidiah didn't argue. He simply walked over, effortlessly lifted the heavy iron maul from the boy's grip, and set a massive log on the stump. "Being a man ain't about doing it all yourself, Thomas. It's about knowing which tool to use and when to learn from someone who survived longer than you." Jedidiah spent the next hour teaching the boy how to read the grain of the wood, how to let the weight of the axe do the work, and how to swing with his hips, not just his arms. By the end of it, Thomas was sweating, exhausted, but a small, proud smile touched his lips. It was the first time Jedidiah had seen the boy look like a child. Charlotte watched them from the frost-covered window. When Jedidiah came back inside, stomping the snow from his boots, she handed him a plate of hot venison stew. She had taken over the cooking, using his meager supplies with a resourcefulness that impressed him. "Thank you," she said softly, her amber eyes meeting his. "For Thomas. He's been carrying too much since Arthur." She trailed off. Jedidiah sat down, blowing on the hot broth. "A boy that age shouldn't have to carry a grown man's sins, Charlotte." She froze, her hand pausing on the wooden spoon in the pot. "What do you mean by that?" "I've seen the bruises on your wrists. I saw the mark on your neck the night you arrived," Jedidiah said, keeping his voice low so the children, playing with carved wooden blocks in the corner, wouldn't hear. "And I know a panicked trail when I see one. You weren't aiming for Oregon. You were running from the Wyoming territory as fast as you could." Charlotte's breath hitched. For a moment, she looked like she might bolt back out into the snow. Then, the fight drained from her. She pulled out a chair and slumped into it, burying her face in her hands. "Arthur wasn't a good man, Jedidiah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was a gambler, a drunk, but worse than that, he was a thief. He got in deep with the Hayes brothers down in Cheyenne." Jedidiah's blood ran cold. Josiah and Cletus Hayes weren't just debt collectors. They were a plague. They ran the cattle rustling and extortion rackets across 3 territories. They were known for burning out homesteaders and leaving no witnesses. "Arthur stole from them," Charlotte continued, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "A lot of money. The payroll for an entire cattle drive. He brought it back to our house, told me to pack the wagon, and said we were leaving. But Josiah Hayes found him before we could get out of town." She looked up, her eyes wide with remembered horror. "They beat him to death in our barn. I saw it from the loft. I packed the children into the wagon in the dead of night and drove it straight into the mountains. I didn't take the money. I left it there. I just wanted my children to live." Jedidiah stared into the fire, the crackling flames reflecting in his hard eyes. He had wanted peace. He had built a fortress of solitude. But looking at the terrified woman across from him and the 3 innocent children sleeping under his roof, the old instincts, the fierce, violent protector he used to be before the war, began to awaken. "The Hayes boys don't give up easily," Jedidiah muttered. "If they think you have the money, they'll track you to the ends of the earth." "I don't have it," she pleaded. "I swear to you, Jedidiah, I left it." "I believe you," he said softly. He reached across the table, his large, rough hand covering her small, trembling one. "And as long as you're in my cabin, they aren't touching you." That night, as the cabin settled into a deep, peaceful sleep, Jedidiah lay awake in his chair by the fire, his rifle resting across his knees. The walls he had built around his heart were crumbling, dismantled by a woman's quiet courage, and the innocent laughs of children he was beginning to view as his own. But out in the dark, the past was hunting them. By the 2nd week of December, the snow had packed down hard enough to bear the weight of a snowshoe. Supplies were running dangerously low. 4 mouths ate significantly more than one. William needed milk, and Charlotte was looking pale and thin, having secretly given half her rations to the children. "I have to make a run to Fort Owen," Jedidiah announced one morning, strapping on his heavy winter gear. "It's a 2-day trek there and back. If I push hard, I can trade some of these prime beaver pelts for flour, oats, canned milk, and medicine." Panic flashed in Charlotte's eyes. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You can't leave us. What if someone finds us?" Jedidiah looked down at her hand, then up to her face. He raised his hand, gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The intimate gesture surprised them both, but neither pulled away. "This cabin is camouflaged into the rock face, and the snow has buried the tracks. Nobody is stumbling up here by accident," he assured her. He pulled his heavy revolver from his holster and pressed it into her hands. "Keep the door barred. Don't light the fire too high during the day. The smoke will be visible. If anyone tries to come through that door, you shoot them. You understand?" Charlotte nodded, her jaw setting with a newfound resolve. "Come back to us, Jedidiah. I always find my way home," he promised. The trek to Fort Owen was brutal, a grueling slog through biting winds and blinding glares off the snowpack. When Jedidiah finally pushed through the doors of the trading post, the warmth of the pot-belly stove and the smell of stale beer hit him like a physical blow. The post was nearly empty, save for the proprietor, a balding man named Gideon, and 2 rough-looking men drinking whiskey in the corner. Jedidiah kept his head down, dumping his heavy sack of pelts on the counter. "Well, I'll be damned. Jed Cooper," Gideon said, his eyes widening. "Thought the winter finally claimed you, mountain man. Takes more than snow to kill me, Gideon. I need flour, salt, dried apples, and condensed milk. Fast." Gideon raised an eyebrow as he began pulling items from the shelves. "Condensed milk? You adopting a bear cub up on that peak, Jed?" Jedidiah didn't smile. "Just pack the bags." As Gideon tallied the trade, Jedidiah's ears caught the low, gravelly voices from the corner table. He didn't want to listen, but survival in the wild meant paying attention to every sound. "Found the wagon down in the lower pass," one man said, striking a match to light a cigar. "Axle was busted, horse shot in the head." "Any sign of the woman?" the other asked. "Tracks were snowed over, but she couldn't have gone far on foot with 3 brats. Boss says we canvass every trapper shack and abandoned mine from here to the border. She's got the $40,000 from the Cheyenne job, and Josiah wants her head on a spike." Jedidiah's blood turned to ice. Josiah Hayes's men. And they had found the wagon. Wait, $40,000? Charlotte had sworn she left the money behind. Why would Josiah's men be so certain she had it? Unless Arthur Stanton was even more cunning and treacherous than his wife knew. What if he had hidden the money in the wagon before he died, and Charlotte had unwittingly driven the fortune straight out of Wyoming? Jedidiah didn't wait for Gideon to finish. He grabbed the burlap sacks of supplies, threw his remaining pelts on the counter to cover the difference, and bolted out the door. "Hey, Cooper!" Gideon yelled, but Jedidiah was already gone, strapping the supplies to his sled with frantic speed. He pushed himself harder than he ever had in his life. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow. He ignored the burning in his lungs and the agonizing cramp in his legs. He hiked through the night, gated only by the silver light of a crescent moon. If Hayes's men had found the wagon in the lower pass, they would start expanding their search grid upward. It was mid-morning when Trapper's Peak finally came into view. Jedidiah was exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and a terrifying, desperate need to protect the family he had accidentally claimed. As he crested the final ridge overlooking the hidden valley where his cabin sat, his heart stopped. There, 100 yards from the cabin, was a man. He was dressed in a heavy buffalo coat, peering through a brass spyglass directly at the thin wisp of smoke rising from Jedidiah's stone chimney. A saddled horse was tied to a nearby pine. The scout was mapping the location. Jedidiah dropped the sled. He unslung his Henry rifle, his hands remarkably steady despite his exhaustion. He didn't shout a warning. In the wild, warnings got you killed. He sighted the rifle. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the mountain walls like thunder. The scout in the buffalo coat jerked violently as the bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around into the snow. The man screamed, clawing at his holster, but Jedidiah was already moving, sliding down the icy embankment like an avalanche. The scout managed to pull his pistol, firing a wild, panicked shot that whipped past Jedidiah's ear. Jedidiah didn't flinch. He closed the distance in seconds, driving the heavy brass butt plate of his rifle straight into the man's jaw. The scout went limp, collapsing into a bloody heap in the snow. Jedidiah stood over him, chest heaving, his eyes wild. He quickly disarmed the unconscious man. This was just a scout, a hound sent to find the scent. But a hound always howled for the rest of the pack. He grabbed the man by his collar and dragged him toward the cabin. He had to get inside. He had to warn Charlotte, because if this man had found them, the rest of the Hayes gang wouldn't be far behind, and they were coming for blood. Jedidiah shoved the heavy oak door open, dragging the unconscious scout inside by the collar of his buffalo coat. The man's boots left a trail of crimson and melted snow across the floorboards. Charlotte gasped, dropping the cast-iron skillet she had been scrubbing. The metallic clatter echoed sharply in the sudden, terrifying silence of the cabin. Thomas immediately stepped in front of his younger siblings, his small fists clenching, his eyes darting from the bloody man to Jedidiah's grim face. "Get the children into the root cellar," Jedidiah ordered, his voice devoid of panic, but vibrating with an urgency that brokered no argument. "Take blankets, the water jug, and keep them completely silent." "Jedidiah, what happened?" "Who is he?" Charlotte asked, her voice trembling as she hurried to gather Sarah and little William. "He's a hunting dog for Josiah Hayes," Jedidiah said, dropping the man near the hearth and immediately stripping him of a second hidden derringer and a wicked-looking hunting knife. "He found the smoke from the chimney. He won't be the only one. They operate in packs. We have maybe an hour before the rest of them ride up that ridge." Charlotte's face drained of all color. She looked at the heavy trapdoor set into the floorboards near the pantry. It was a dark, cramped space, meant for potatoes and cured meats, not a family of 4. But the alternative was standing in the crossfire of ruthless killers. She nodded once, her maternal instincts overriding her terror. "Come, children, quickly." As Charlotte ushered them down, Jedidiah grabbed Thomas by the shoulder. "Boy, I need you up here for 5 minutes. Grab every box of ammunition from that top shelf and stack them on the table. Then help me move the flour barrels in front of the windows." Thomas didn't hesitate. The boy moved with a frantic efficiency, his fear channeled into action. Together, they fortified the small cabin. Jedidiah knocked out the chinking between specific logs to create narrow firing ports. He loaded his Henry rifle, his heavy Colt revolver, and a double-barreled scattergun he usually reserved for grizzly bears. When the cabin was as secure as timber and iron could make it, Jedidiah sent Thomas down into the dark cellar with his mother. Before closing the heavy oak trapdoor, Jedidiah looked down at Charlotte. Her amber eyes were wide in the gloom. "I won't let them take you," Jedidiah swore, the vow settling in his bones like iron. "Come back to us," she whispered, echoing the plea from his trip to the trading post. Jedidiah dropped the door shut and slid a heavy trunk over it. He was alone again. But the silence felt entirely different now. It wasn't the peace of solitude. It was the breathless quiet before a slaughter. He tied the scout to a heavy chair, gagging him with a rag. Then Jedidiah slipped out the back window. If he stayed trapped inside the cabin, it was only a matter of time before Hayes's men threw torches onto the roof and burned them out. He had to take the fight to the mountain. He was the apex predator of Trapper's Peak, and it was time to remind these city-dwelling rustlers what that meant. For the next 40 minutes, Jedidiah moved like a ghost through the timberline surrounding the clearing. He used every skill the wilderness had taught him over 7 brutal years. He set heavy, iron-jawed bear traps beneath fresh dustings of snow on the main approach. He rigged a massive, dead-standing pine tree with a rope and tension trigger, creating a deadfall that would crush anything on the trail beneath it. He was a man going to war, fighting not for his own miserable life, but for the innocent souls huddled in the dark beneath his floor. The wind picked up, howling through the pines, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of breaking crust snow and the snorting of laboring horses. Jedidiah situated himself on a high ridge of granite overlooking the cabin, completely camouflaged by his white canvas winter duster. He peered down the sights of his rifle. They emerged from the tree line like a plague of locusts against the pristine white. 8 men. They were heavily armed, wearing thick dusters and woolen masks pulled up over their noses. At the front of the pack rode a man on a massive black roan. He wore a bowler hat, incongruous in the wild, and a tailored coat. Even from a distance, Jedidiah could see the cruel, relaxed posture of a man who believed he owned the world. Josiah Hayes. Josiah held up a gloved hand, halting his men at the edge of the clearing. He pulled a brass megaphone from his saddlebag. "Charlotte Stanton," Josiah's voice boomed, distorted and metallic, echoing off the canyon walls. "I know you're in there. My scout's horse is tied out back, and you left a trail of desperation a mile wide. Come on out, darling. It's freezing out here, and my boys are getting impatient." Silence answered him. Inside the cabin, the scout muffled a groan through his gag. Josiah chuckled, a sound that carried easily on the cold air. "Now, Charlotte, I'm a reasonable man. I don't want to shoot up a cabin with children inside, but Arthur made a mess of my livelihood. You see, your husband didn't just steal my payroll. He made a deal with me before he did it. He promised me the deed to your brother's Oregon claim to settle his gambling debts. And then he promised me you, Charlotte. Said you were pretty enough to fetch a high price down in the Nevada brothels." In the cellar, hidden beneath the floorboards, Charlotte clamped a hand over her mouth. Hot tears of absolute betrayal and horror streaming down her face. Arthur had truly been a monster to the very end. "But the joke's on him, ain't it?" Josiah continued, his voice turning vicious. "Because he got greedy. He took the 40,000 and he sewed it into the lining of that ridiculously heavy buffalo coat he made your boy wear. We found the tailor down in Cheyenne who did the job. Beaten half to death, the tailor confessed everything. Arthur was going to ditch you and the kids in the mountains and take the coat to San Francisco." Jedidiah's breath hitched in the freezing air. The coat. Thomas had been wearing Arthur's oversized, incredibly heavy winter coat since they arrived. They had been carrying a fortune on the boy's back the entire time, completely unaware. "So bring me the coat, Charlotte, and I'll let you and the brats walk away," Josiah lied, drawing his revolver. "You have 60 seconds before we burn that shack to the ground." Jedidiah didn't wait. He sighted the Henry rifle on the man closest to Josiah, a burly thug holding a torch soaked in pitch. Crack! The thunderous report of the rifle shattered the tense silence. The thug with the torch dropped instantly, a clean hole through his chest. His torch fell into the snow, hissing as it extinguished. "Sniper! Up on the ridge!" one of the men screamed, his horse rearing in panic. Chaos erupted. 2 men charged their horses toward the ridge, drawing their Winchesters, but they didn't know the terrain. The lead horse stepped directly onto the hidden trigger of Jedidiah's deadfall. With a sickening crack, the tension rope snapped, and the massive, dead pine tree swung down like a pendulum. It slammed into the 2 riders, sweeping them violently from their saddles and crushing them into the snowbank. "Dismount! Get to cover, you fools!" Josiah roared, diving off his black roan and scurrying behind the stone well in the center of the yard. Another man tried to sprint toward the rear of the cabin. His boot found one of the concealed bear traps. The steel jaws snapped shut with a horrific clang, shattering his shin bone. His screams joined the howling wind. Jedidiah racked the lever of his rifle, firing with a cold, mechanical precision. He clipped another man in the shoulder, sending him spinning into the snow. But there were still 4 men left, including Josiah, and they were seasoned killers. They began laying down a massive volley of suppressive fire against the ridge, chipping away the granite where Jedidiah was hidden. Bullets whined and ricocheted dangerously close to his face. He was pinned down, and he was running out of ammunition in his primary weapon. Worse, Josiah Hayes was motioning for 2 of his remaining men to flank the ridge from the eastern slope. If they got behind him, it was over. The air tasted of sulfur, metallic blood, and splintered pine. Jedidiah Cooper, bleeding freely from a superficial bullet graze along his left temple, moved like a phantom through the heavy, waist-deep snowdrifts. He had been forced to abandon his high granite ridge when Josiah Hayes's men brought a concentrated, deafening barrage of Winchester fire upon his position, chewing the rock into powder. Now, he was circling back to the cabin, his heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. He knew the tactical reality of a siege. Keep the strongest defender pinned down under heavy fire, while the flankers move in to breach the walls. He rounded the western corner of the cabin just as Bates, a towering enforcer with a face scarred like cured leather, drove his heavy, steel-toed boot through the cabin's rear window. The glass shattered outward, raining sharp shards into the small kitchen. Jedidiah lunged before the man could draw his weapon. He didn't waste a precious bullet. He grabbed Bates by the thick woolen collar of his duster and hauled him backward with pure, brute force, throwing the heavy man violently into the snow. Before the thug could orient himself or shout a warning, Jedidiah brought the heavy steel barrel of his Colt revolver across Bates's jaw in a vicious arc. The man went limp instantly, his eyes rolling back in his head. 1 down, 3 left. Then came a sound that froze the very blood in Jedidiah's veins, the deafening, booming roar of a 12-gauge scattergun echoing from the front porch. It was his gun, the one he had left on the kitchen table to guard the trapdoor. Jedidiah sprinted to the front of the cabin, ignoring the burning in his lungs. A hired gun lay writhing in the red-stained snow, his shoulder shredded by a massive spread of buckshot. Standing in the open doorway, pale as a ghost, but holding the heavy shotgun with white-knuckled determination, was 12-year-old Thomas. The boy had climbed out of the root cellar to defend his family. "Thomas, get down!" Jedidiah roared over the howling wind. Emerging from behind the stone well was Josiah Hayes himself. The crime boss's bowler hat was gone, his expensive tailored coat dusted with powder, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He raised his silver-plated revolver, ignoring Jedidiah completely, and aimed squarely at the boy's chest. Time fractured, slowing to a grueling crawl. Jedidiah didn't have the angle to shoot. He simply threw his massive frame forward, diving into the direct line of fire between the crime boss and the child. The gunshot cracked like a bullwhip. A sledgehammer of white-hot agony punched through Jedidiah's left thigh. The sheer kinetic impact spun him around, dropping him heavily to the blood-stained snow. "Jedidiah!" Thomas screamed, dropping the empty shotgun and stepping forward. "Stay inside," Jedidiah grunted, spitting blood into the snow. Josiah laughed, a wet, ragged sound, stepping out confidently from his cover. The last of his men had abandoned him, fleeing into the tree line, but Josiah was too consumed by vengeance to care. "Ain't this poetic?" he sneered, cocking the hammer for a finishing shot. The great mountain man dying in the snow for another man's brats. "I'll be taking that buffalo coat now, boy, right after I finish him." But the wilderness had one final trap, laid not by nature, but by the mountain man himself. The night before, anticipating a raid, Jedidiah had purposely diverted the runoff from the hot spring directly over the main approach to the porch. Beneath the fresh dusting of powder lay a thick, invisible sheet of black ice. As Josiah confidently planted his leather boot to stabilize his executioner's aim, his foot shot out from under him. He flailed violently, his balance completely betraying him. His finger jerked the trigger in panic, sending the bullet digging harmlessly into the timber roof. Through the blinding haze of pain, Jedidiah raised his Colt. He didn't hesitate. He fired twice. The heavy .45 caliber slugs caught Josiah Hayes square in the center of his chest. The crime boss collapsed backward into the snowdrift. He stared up at the gray winter sky, his eyes wide with shock, before the brutal mountain wind silenced him forever. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the blizzard itself. Jedidiah let his head fall back into the freezing powder, the edges of his vision darkening as shock set in. Suddenly, small, frantic hands were pulling at his coat. Charlotte had thrown open the heavy oak door, rushing to his side with a desperation that defied the bitter cold. "Hold his shoulders," she instructed Thomas, her hands quickly assessing the catastrophic bleeding from his thigh. She ripped her own apron into strips, using the thick canvas